Yes. So if you have, so we can ask questions now about either of these sessions, the methodology or the Genesis 1. Question and answer. What I always say is we're all friends here. We're all Christians here, so we treat each other appropriately. So we're full of grace. They'll know we're Christians by our love. Make sure it's a question, not your own lecture. And
I believe that I got this idea from something you said in your book, and that basically is that the cosmology presented in Genesis 1 is an ancient Near Eastern cosmology, firmament, etc. And I know you only have a certain amount of time. But the point I think you made was that what God is, from a cosmological standpoint versus a theological standpoint, God isn't interested in reteaching them some sort of proper scientific cosmology. He goes with their cosmology as their science, if you will, as they have it. He's interested in fixing the theology of it. And I've used that a lot too. I was wondering if there was anything you could add to that.
No, that's basically the idea. Remember that effective communication is going to work on that which is familiar. So God talks to them about the home story using their ideas about how they understood the cosmos and its structure and all of that, because he wasn't there to try to upgrade their science. Again, there is no scientific revelation going on here. When we look at the truth claims, are the truth claims scientific in nature? No, they're theological in nature. That's what the author intends. That's what the audience understands in that cultural river. And so that's what we have to work with. So we shouldn't try to turn it into a modern day science kind of discussion. He used what they knew. And there's not a single new piece of information in the scientific realm that differentiates them. Any Babylonian, any Egyptian would have understood precisely what was going on in Genesis 1. It's not based on upgraded science. Yeah, go to the microphone. Yeah.
I think I understood you to say that God was calling his people out of the other polytheistic systems. And so, just briefly, it doesn't have to be great detail, but how was this story different from the creation stories that they may have already heard and other people followed in the ancient Near East?
Good, thank you. Good question. Basically, the differences in this creation story and what we have in the rest of the ancient Near East have to do with the differences in God, in how God presented himself. Yeah. And there are three levels of differences that are tied into what I call interdependencies. That is, first of all, in the ancient Near East, the gods were interdependent with the pieces of the cosmos, the sun god and the sun, the moon god and the moon. There's an interdependence between the objects and the gods that are connected to them. Israel, it's not like that. God's not inside the cosmos, he's outside the cosmos. Okay? Even though he's coming to live in it. 2, the interdependency among the gods themselves. In a polytheistic world, the gods were interdependent. One god had its own jurisdiction, another god has another jurisdiction, and this one can't do anything in this jurisdiction. It's like the various vice presidents in a corporation. Sorry, I'm the vice president of marketing. You're the vice president of operations. Don't tell me what to do in marketing. Okay? So there's an interdependence in the realm of the gods. Thirdly, there's an interdependence in the realm of gods interacting with people. In the ancient world, they believed that the gods had created people because the gods had needs to be met. They needed food, they needed housing, they needed clothing, and they got sick and tired of doing it themselves. And so they created people as slave labor to meet their needs. And so the rituals that people performed were to feed the gods and to house the gods. And so the gods became interdependent on people. Okay, and people dependent on the gods, gods dependent on people. So in the ancient Near Eastern realm, the gods were of a different sort, 3 levels of interdependency. And in Genesis, you have none of it. No interdependencies. God didn't create people so they could feed him. He plants a garden for them to have food. He doesn't need them. And God's not in need of other gods who have other jurisdiction. And God is outside the cosmos, not inside the cosmos. So it's very different from the ancient Near East because of how God is perceived and presented. It's very much the same as the ancient Near East because it's the same issues of God's presence and of a home story and of order being the highest value and all of those things. Similarities and differences. Great question. Thank you. Steve.
So when I read I haven't read all your books, but the
Me
ones
neither.
that I've read, it's profoundly changed how I think about like my mission in the world and how God interacts with the world and how I relate to people. And I'm curious as to this journey that you've been on, how does it change all of those things for you? Your perception of who God is and how God acts in the world and how God acts in your life and all of those things, how has it affected you?
It affects how I think about what the Bible's trying to tell me about God and how it communicates that. Again, if it's communicating within the ancient world and the ancient perceptions, then certainly it's not trying to give me a systematic theology. That's the way we do things. It's not the way Israel did things. So I have to be careful that I don't go to the Bible looking for a systematic theology. I have to be careful that I don't go to the Bible looking to try to pin God into certain metaphysical categories. Because in the ancient world, they didn't think in metaphysical categories. So if I'm trying to get biblical teaching, I can't do it using categories they didn't have. Okay, so it's even in those areas, it doesn't change my view of God, but it makes me think differently about what am I getting from the Bible and how am I getting that. So that's just a quick answer that covers part of it. Jeff.
So, John, if they had gods doing all kinds of things, then nothing would have been supernatural. It would have been natural. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Again, whenever we talk about the ancient world, we have to evaluate what categories and classification terms we're using, because we have to be aware that they might not categorize things the same way. So when we try to talk about the world as we understand it in terms of that which is natural, as following natural laws and natural cause and effect and all of those things, and we contrast that to supernatural, here are things that science will never explain, that there's no natural laws that will explain it, but this is truly God at work, intervening, doing the miraculous. We think that way all the time, but the ancient world, they did not. So if we try to go to the Bible and extract this distinction between something being natural or supernatural, we're doomed to fail because they didn't use the categories. In the ancient world, everything was the work of God. There was no natural. There was ordinary, there was regularity. Okay, so they understood they plant a seed and a plant grows. That's normal. Okay, but they didn't call that natural because they believed God did that. God made that seed grow. So the things that we call natural are things that they would say were the work of God, because everything was the work of God. And so there are no natural laws. There's the work of God. Sustaining regularity. That's what God does. Order in the world. That regularity is order, and God sustains it. God's the one who does that. So when we try to draw that distinction, it can't help but be an artificial one, because they don't have it. So when we go and look at the plagues and somebody says, well, okay, the plagues are very understandable. You know, when we know of red tide, red algae that comes down from the mountains of Central Africa, turns the rivers red. It's happened a few times in history. And it's algae. It kills the fish, and therefore the frogs go jumping out of the water. And then the frogs can't be sustained outside, and they die. And then the frogs all die, and so they're going to be flies. And someone will object to that and say, wait a minute, you're taking the miraculous out of it. You're taking God out of it. Now, that would only be true if you assumed that something that had a natural explanation was not God. See, our problem is our modern categories. And so it wouldn't matter if you could explain every single one of the plagues by scientific cause and effect. It wouldn't matter. God did it anyway. Okay, so if they have no natural, they can't have a supernatural category. Because the supernatural says it's not natural. If there is no natural, and it's all God at work, then we're imposing categories on them that they didn't have. So that's, and this happens in lots of different places. Yeah.
So growing up in the information age, well done, by the way. How do you fit evolution into your perspective now?
That's going to come this afternoon, because we're talking about Adam and Eve this afternoon. And so we'll talk about kind of all of that. Again, just as a kind of laying the direction for us, evolution, of course, is a modern construct. And whether people think it's true or false or whatever, it's a modern construct. It represents a way for us to understand what we see. And of course, some people will disagree with that understanding. But if you start to ask about what's the biblical view of evolution, whoops. Okay, it's a modern construct. So we'll talk about that more this afternoon. Thank you.
Two quick things. One is the idea of creative, right? You talked about creating a community, creating things out of. What we're doing as made in the image of God is taking things that exist and putting them into order like a community. People in the community existed before, but not in that order, not for that purpose, right? And so that thought comes in alignment with the Word of God, saying that we're made in His image creatively, right? Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, how does now that we've gone through this Genesis 1, it throws like the time, our construct of time out the window in a sense. Mm-hmm. So are we going to address that too going forward about how the ancient peoples looked at time?
Well, time is a big issue. Time, history, nature. I mean, name any of our big words, and they think about it differently than we do. So we can't impose our ideas. Again, we have encyclopedic references for every single one of those. You take something like time. We think of ourselves typically as sort of standing on a timeline, and we're facing the future. And the past is behind us. Put it behind us. We're in the present, and we look to the future with anticipation. In the ancient world, that was not the case. They were this way. They had their face to the past, learning from it, appreciating it, respecting it, thinking of their fathers and their ancestors, and looking to the past as what held the best. The future was behind them, and it was dark and unknown and scary. So just something like that, how you orient yourself.
Well, then, this follow-up to that then is we're so prophetically focused on the return of Christ and all this kind of stuff, and the days and tribulation and that kind of stuff. So when you have a different focus of looking back, it puts that in different context. So I'm just curious.
Well, and thank you, yes. And that also gets into all the questions about what is their view of what prophecy is. Yeah. That's another Lost World book. Someday, maybe. Other questions? These are good questions. Thank you. Excellent questions.
So since understanding Genesis 1 is coming from an ancient Near East perspective, and Jehovah resides outside of time, to understand his future kingdom and what is to come, do you feel that it will be set up as an ancient Near East society? And I forgot my other question. I'll go ahead and answer that one.
Okay. I don't, those things which are just God's way of communicating into a cultural river, we should not idealize them as if that's the way it's supposed to be. It's simply the way that he was communicating to them because that was their culture. There may be some parts of their culture that are better than the way that we do it. For instance, I think that a case could be made that the community identity of the ancient world is a much better way to go than the individualistic identity of our world, which has led to all kinds of problems. But that's another kind of discussion. That's not a what is biblical. We can't say the community identity is more biblical just because that was the system that they used there. So it's not intended to idealize that, and therefore when I think about the future, I don't think of it as having to take the shape of an ancient Near Eastern cultural river. Although when new creation is described in Revelation 21, it takes the shape of how Greco-Roman people were thinking at that time. But again, it has to. Communication works that way. Okay?
So my next question.
Right.
So we get this idea that Jehovah is sitting on the throne and he is ruling society. When I take a look at society now, I don't see a lot of us adhering to his laws and his order. Would he be perceiving us as non-existent or just disordered?
Yeah. In some ways, that would fit. I mean, we believe God is on his throne. Christ is seated at the right hand of God. It's what we believe. So God has not abdicated and God has not just kind of gone away. Yet, of course, there's the freedom he gives us to fail and to do wrong, which has always been his policy for whatever reasons. And so in that sense, he maintains order at a certain level, but there are also other ways in which disorder reigns in our world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get to the flood, as in terms of how God responds to those kinds of things. So God is still ruling in the world, but we live in a world which has non-order still, which has order because God has set up a modicum of order, and which has disorder, people working against God's order to disrupt it. And so we live in a world of three: non-order, order, and disorder. God created us so that we might work alongside him to bring order, subdue and rule, right? All of those things, image of God, so that we would work alongside him. He didn't need us to do that, but he deputized us to do that. He created us to do that. We chose our own path. We chose that instead of us working to bring about God's order, we wanted to work to bring about order for ourselves. That's the fruit in the tree. I mean, it's a wisdom tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's how wisdom is expressed. Wisdom is the pathway to order. Wisdom is the pathway to order. So when we took from the wisdom tree, we were saying we want to do it ourselves. Order should be centered around us. And that's been the history of the world. Okay, and so God has a plan to resolve that. But the fact that we have insisted on that role since the garden is kind of why we are in the mess we are in today. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Yeah, it's just understanding his perspective is like when he looks down, he's not sitting on the throne on the earth. I mean,
Right.
as the evidence of our actions and things that we're doing.
Right. But he still rules in the cosmos. Yeah. Yeah. Is there another one? Okay. We're done?